I am Michael Harris. I am 72 years old this year. Today, I want to tell a more personal story. I hope you listen carefully because if you are considering divorce, this may help you. I lived with my wife for 26 years before our divorce, and I have lived alone for 21 years since. For most of my life before the divorce, I genuinely believed I had a good marriage. It wasn't perfect, but it was stable. There was respect. From the outside, it looked like a marriage without serious problems. At the time, I didn't know this. Most marriages don't fall apart because of one big event. They fall apart because of things that keep getting postponed. You notice them, but you tell yourself they can wait. And when that waiting repeats long enough, people eventually stop talking altogether. We didn't divorce because of constant fighting. There was no affair. There was no dramatic explosion. Over time, we simply stopped having real conversations, and that silence led us to divorce. The moment I finally saw what I had been missing came while we were going through the divorce paperwork. That was when my wife said this to me. She had been lonely for a long time, and I had never noticed. My first reaction was defensiveness. I had always worked hard for my family. I focused on responsibility. I focused on keeping the structure of our family intact. I believed that if the structure held, the relationship would naturally follow. And that belief, quietly and without anyone noticing, was where everything began to weaken. For decades, I thought everything was functioning well. We had schedules. We had roles. We had a shared life that moved without disruption. The truth didn't arrive all at once. It didn't come out in arguments or moments of anger or dramatic scenes that forced awareness. Instead, it hid behind the reassurance that nothing seemed wrong and settled in very slowly. That is why I am telling this story now. I mistook stability for happiness. For years, my wife spoke to me about very small things. They weren't complaints or confrontations. They were simply moments she wanted to share. And if you are listening to this and thinking, there's nothing wrong with my marriage, you may already be standing exactly where I once stood. At the time, those moments didn't register as warnings. They felt ordinary, easy to explain away. My wife would mention how quiet the house felt in the evenings, even when we were both there. She would ask how my day had been, and wait just a little longer than necessary for an answer. Sometimes she suggested we take a walk. Sometimes she asked if we could sit together for a few minutes without the television on. Sometimes she just wanted to talk before the day ended. There was one evening I remember clearly. She told me our son had gotten into trouble at school and asked if we could talk about it for a few minutes. I told her I had a lot on my plate and asked if we could talk later. I don't even remember if we ever did. None of these moments sounded urgent. None of them sounded like a problem. And almost every time, I responded the same way. I told her I was tired. I told her work had been heavy. I told her we could talk later. Tomorrow, over the weekend. Those responses felt reasonable to me. They sounded like the words of a responsible man doing what he thought he was supposed to do. I believed postponing a conversation was different from refusing it. But postponement repeats itself. The same exchanges returned again and again, spread out over months and years. Each moment was small enough to ignore on its own, but together they carried weight. Because we weren't fighting, I assumed everything was fine. Because nothing looked broken, I never stopped to ask what was slowly wearing down. Over time, her requests became simpler, shorter. She stopped explaining why something mattered to her. She stopped circling back when I delayed. I noticed the change, but I didn't question it. I told myself this was what long marriages turned into. Comfortable, efficient, quiet. I believed comfort meant security. I believed silence meant understanding. What I didn't see was that the same silence was teaching her something very different. It was teaching her that reaching out didn't change the outcome, that waiting didn't bring closeness, that adjusting expectations was easier than continuing to ask. And because there was no argument, no confrontation, no moment that demanded action, I never labeled this as a problem. I believed problems announced themselves loudly. I didn't understand that some endings are built slowly, through repetition, through reasonable excuses, through moments that are always postponed and quietly never returned to. I didn't understand what I had missed until much later. Not during the arguments, not during the paperwork, not even on the day she left. It showed up quietly, in places that didn't feel important at the time. One evening, long after the divorce, I was sitting alone watching television. A travel program came on: mountains, lakes, quiet villages, Switzerland. I remember the image clearly because something in me tightened when I saw it. Not sadness exactly, recognition. She used to watch those programs too. She would pause and say how beautiful it looked, how peaceful. She said she wanted to see it someday. I remember nodding. I remember saying things like, yeah, it looks nice, or maybe one day. At the time, those words felt harmless. They felt neutral. I didn't argue. I didn't refuse. I didn't say no, and that's what makes it harder to face now. Because I wasn't rejecting her. I was postponing her. And postponement feels reasonable when you believe time is guaranteed. Looking back, I realize I treated her words like background noise, information, not an invitation, something to acknowledge, not something that required a response. I didn't hear urgency because there was no crisis. I didn't hear need because she wasn't demanding. I didn't hear loneliness because it wasn't loud. I told myself that if something really mattered, it would come up again. And when it didn't, I assumed it hadn't been important. What I see now is that silence didn't mean acceptance. It meant resignation. She wasn't waiting for the right time anymore. She was learning what kind of answers to expect. I thought I was being patient. I thought I was being practical. I thought I was listening. But listening isn't nodding. Listening is responding while the moment still exists. I want you to think about this carefully, not defensively, not quickly. When your partner talks about something small, something that doesn't sound urgent, do you hear it as information or as a request to be met? Do you store it away for later, or do you treat it as something that belongs to now? Because I did what many men do. I believed love was proven by stability, by showing up, by not leaving. I didn't realize that you can stay and still be absent. You can agree with everything and still fail to respond. And one day, without a fight, without a warning, you find yourself realizing that all those later moments have quietly expired. Switzerland was never just a place. It was a moment I didn't step into. And by the time I understood that, the moment was already gone. After the divorce was finalized, I went back to the house we had shared. At first, I didn't feel much of anything. I told people I was fine. I told myself this was just another adjustment. I unpacked boxes. I set up the kitchen. I went to work. For a few days, it almost felt manageable. But then something shifted. It didn't happen all at once. It arrived quietly, a few days later, when I reached the end of an ordinary evening and realized there was no one to talk to about it, no one to tell a small story to, no one to ask how their day had been. The silence wasn't dramatic. That was the problem. It was complete. For months, I moved through my days like that. I learned how to fill time. I learned how to be alone without falling apart. People call that strength, and maybe it is. But strength has a cost. When you live without being witnessed, you start convincing yourself that what you carry isn't that heavy. 21 years have passed since then. I adapted. Life went on. But adaptation is not the same as resolution. Some realizations don't fade with time. They settle. There's something else I think about now. Around the time I got married, I had a friend. He saw my marriage from the outside, from beginning to end. Years before the divorce, he said something to me once. He asked if I thought I might be a little too distant with my wife. He didn't accuse me. He didn't push. He said it almost casually. I remember nodding and changing the subject. After the divorce, I replayed that moment more times than I can count. Not because he was right, but because he noticed something I refused to look at. I often wonder what would have happened if I had asked him to keep talking, if I had stopped defending myself long enough to listen. Here's what I know now. Silence doesn't mean peace. Stability doesn't mean safety. And being busy doesn't excuse being absent. Most marriages don't end because someone makes one terrible choice. They end because of a pattern that never gets interrupted, because later becomes a habit, because silence feels easier than curiosity. If you're listening to this and thinking, this isn't about me, I want you to slow down. Ask yourself when you last checked in without an agenda, when you last treated a small comment as important, when you last chose presence over efficiency. Because time doesn't warn you before it closes a door. It just keeps moving. I'm 72 years old. I've lived long enough to know that regret doesn't come from what you didn't know. It comes from what you noticed and chose not to act on. If you still have someone beside you, you still have time. But not later, now. If you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, please like, subscribe, and share. Your support helps us continue creating good content to inform and inspire you.